Let's go over this recent game between Anton Korobov and Magnus Carlsen at the FIDE Online Championships, because I wanted to show how masters think about central play. To us as developing players, often the moves look like random moves. But let's look at how they have a specific focus on the center. So we'll only do the first 20 or so moves of the game. But this is, to me, was a very good example of how they exhibit central control. So this is how I suggest you think about the opening moves and how they control the center. So d4, not a random move, controls e5 and c5. d5, doing the opposite, getting squares in the white camp. c4 is played, targeting the pawn on d5. e6, supporting the pawn on d5 and also reinforcing f5. And a c3, adding pressure to the pawn on d5 and backing up control of e4. Carlsen with c6, supporting his pawn on d5. e3 by Korobov, supporting f4, but also critically our pawn on d4. And f6. Why is that an f6 played? It provides reinforcement over d5 and some attack and control and influence over e4. And f3, supporting our pawn on d4 and exerting influence over e5. And at b to d7 by Carlsen, supporting his knight on f6 and having influence over the more central squares e5 and c5. Queen to c2, influence over the white square diagonal running through d3, e4, very critical squares, and going all the way to h7, which could be very critical if black eventually castles kingside. B to d6. So some influence over these squares, c5, and especially e5 as well, also potentially pointing into the white king if it were to castle kingside with influence over h2. B to d3, supporting the queen, continuing to support the pawn on c4, and also adding to the pressure along this light square diagonal, again cutting through e4 and f5. So all these moves, central control. These are king safety moves. So get the king to safety after they have good central development. Carlsen decides to take on c4, threatening bishop on d3. When we take back, Korobov has a direct line of influence right into the black king. Critical squares are in the center, d5, e6. Queen e7. Also a centralizing move, getting off the back rank, allowing the rooks to connect, and the queen now has influence all the way over the e-file, and also all the way down this diagonal through c5, all the way down to a3. a3. So this is a prophylactic move. So to this point, aside from the castling moves, all the play has been exclusively focused around central squares. And in this case, sometimes what needs to happen is a prophylactic move because the knight on c3 is supporting d5 and e4. We want to make sure that black cannot come in with the bishop to b4, potentially removing this knight and therefore our influence over the central squares. So it's not just about creating control over the center. It's also about, at times, either undermining pieces that control the central squares on the wing, but also taking prophylactic moves like a3 to prevent any black piece from coming into b4. These moves, a3, h3, and the corresponding moves on the black side, a6 and h6, are overused at the club level, and they're too slow, where the players should be focusing really on the center. And it's only after they've achieved the structure they want that they would play a prophylactic move, making sure that their super strong piece that they want to retain control of the center with does not get undermined. So for example, had we not done that, black could potentially have played b5 and then b4. So this bishop would be knocked away, which would mean it wouldn't have control over d5. And then if the pawn continued its push down to b4, then this knight would have to move, and that would remove influence over these squares, potentially allowing things like the black knight to come into d5, exhibiting great control down here. So it's all about central squares and control over the center. a6. So same idea by Carlsen. He's trying to make sure that this square isn't used, but in this case, it's more to support the push of b5 because he doesn't want he wants to be able to have the option of recapturing with both sides. This bishop still needs to develop. So r to d1 by white, control over the d file, protecting the pawn on d4 as well. b5. So this hits the bishop on c4. This bishop, as we said, had the influence right through to the black king, so we have to retreat. It goes back to, where does it go? So a developing player might go back to d3, which might not be horrible because it's still centrally controlled. e2, which would be far worse. But Korobov decides to do bishop to a2, and look at the control he exhibits right through to the black king. c5, hitting the pawn on d4. So this is an example of somewhat of a wing move to undermine control in the center. Korobov decides to take, and that opens up the rook that he's placed on d1. So excellent developing move that he had done earlier, and now has influence over this semi-open file at this point with lots of targets in the black camp now. Bishop recaptures. That controls d4, e3, all the way through to the white king, and goes to e4. And this increases the influence that the knight has. So it's now attacking the knight on f6. It's now controlling, crucially, d6 as well. It's also targeting the bishop, and potentially also the square on g5. Although not a central square, it's heading towards the opponent's king, so that could be important. Carlsen plays bishop to b5, cutting right through the center. d5, e4, f3, right through to g2. All these moves influence squares in the center. We get rid of the bishop on c5, which had good influence through to our king. Also targeting this bishop that's exposed on b7, which white would love to get rid of because it has strong influence. This knight in the center, this pawn that's crucially placed in the black camp at e6, and also as you move pieces forward, they look back with influence sometimes too. So this knight is now influencing e4 and d3. So Carlsen decides to get rid of it. Our white queen now has control over a semi-open file, but the problem that Korobov will have to deal with is that it's very likely that a rook is coming to the c8 file. So he decides to get his queen to safety and out of the way of that file. Note right now, he could not play b4 because the knight would just simply come into a4 and potentially ruin this square that he's going to need to develop his c1 bishop at, which is b2. So the other key thing to think about, though, with the white queen going e2 is the influence over the e file and this diagonal going through to a6. So nf to e4, targeting all these squares in the white camp. So again, a forward move that still has backwards influence over these central squares, but also attacking c3, d2, and then right by the white king, f2 and g3. And a d4. The knight had good control over the two dark central squares here, but in this position on d4, especially with these four black pieces now starting to have some influence, Korobov decides to get better control over the center, and it is in part is going to play a bit of a defensive move, e5. So the drawback of any pawn push is that these squares are no longer influenced, but Carlsen recognizes that Korobov right now doesn't have a great way of pursuing that. So you're always giving up something when you move, but in this case, there's no good way for Korobov to attack that. And now he's got a tempo on the white knight. So in f5, hitting the queen, controlling these central squares on the d file, and also supporting the pawn on e3. Queen comes in to attack it. So not really a centralizing move, but more of a play directing the energy towards the king side and also getting to the knight with tempo, and goes to g3. It becomes a target here from this black knight that's been very well placed on e4 by Carlsen. r8 to d8, getting to an open file and controlling the d file right through the center. And this is where the game starts to drift into the late middle game and end game. So we'll stop the analysis here, but I hope this was helpful to show that all the moves that are played in the opening, when they're played by masters, generally focus on central control. All the emphasis is on the center. And hopefully that will encourage you to stop playing slow moves at times like h6 when it's not necessary, h3 when it's not necessary, and moves that remove control over the center instead of constantly trying to increase your influence over the center.